Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Preacher Creature podcast. I'm so excited that you decided to spend a little bit of your time with us today. My name is Jake Myers. I teach homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. And I also offer coaching for preachers who are looking to take their preaching up to the next level at thepreachingdoctor.com. So check me out if you want some extra help.
And I'm Ashley Lewis. So glad to be back with you all again. Thanks for hanging with us at Preacher Creature. I live here in Durham, North Carolina, and I am a practicing homiletician, practicing preacher. I work in both nonprofit and church spaces and focus on preaching and teaching beyond the human experience for the good of all creation.
Yes, and if you want to find out more opportunities to connect with us, please make sure that you subscribe to this channel. Hit a like button if you find it helpful for your ministry, and also check us out on social media under the Columbia Preacher Studio for Renewal. The Preacher Creature podcast is a part of a larger thing that we're doing here at Columbia Theological Seminary, and we're really excited to help preachers to preach more compelling sermons. That's really our foundational goal. So I hope you check us out and connect with us.
So, Jake, today we're going to have an awesome discussion with a homiletician who's working in the space of digital preaching. So, our guest today is we're going to dive deep into all the things that have changed since preaching took a huge turn to go mostly online or almost exclusively online during the pandemic in 2020. It's such an exciting conversation and an exciting book. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation. I've been trying to help resource preachers who alums who reached out to me right when the pandemic hit, and they're like, "Help! You didn't teach us how to preach online." And Anna Carter Florence, my colleague in homiletics here at Columbia, and I were like, "Oh my gosh, we should have added like a unit on that or something." And it was a lot of experimentation, trying to help resource folks, giving feedback. I was kind of in a support role really because I'm not a wasn't pastoring a church, so I had a very different kind of angle of vision on what was going on with the online preaching phenomenon. But as I have begun to teach courses on this at Columbia for students, I realized there are very few resources out there that speak specifically to preaching online.
Right.
And that's why this book, Digital Homiletics, is so important. And I know that anyone who takes a look at this book is going to really be happy that they did, because the way that Dr. Sunggu Yang lays out the options, he really expanded, my horizon to think about
Yeah,
preaching in new ways in these online spaces.
absolutely. I was actually in class with you when the
That's right.
pandemic happened. It was spring of 2020, and we were partway through a class on contemporary homiletical theories in my second year of seminary at Columbia. And that meant that our final project, instead of being preached in person, for example, for that class, we all had to shift what we were planning to do and take it online. And that was, I think, so memorable for me because it was a sermon that was coming out of our experience of transitioning online, if that
That's
makes
right.
sense.
Yeah.
But it wasn't actually the first time I ever preached online. I think when I worked with Creature Kind, which is a nonprofit that's web based, we at when I worked at that nonprofit organization. And they still do this, but they foster online community for folks who are concerned about creation and animal welfare in particular. And so we would regularly host online worship services for our followers, which
Yeah.
is something that's so common now, but was sort of unusual at that time. And so I believe that I preached or at least helped lead worship in that online space even before the pandemic happened. But that was really a turning point in that organization because it was showing us that there was going to be much more of an appetite and a relevance for online preaching, like there hadn't really even we hadn't even considered
Yeah.
before spring of 2020. So it took it to a new level for sure.
Yeah, and I actually got to preach for Creature Kind one time. Thanks for the invitation. That was fun.
Yes, it was so fun. I loved all my time with them. So yeah, I mean, what else are you noticing about the online preaching space these days, or maybe what are things that you pulled out of Sunggu Yang's book that were highlights for you about the styles of online preaching?
Yeah, well, there's so many things. I don't want to steal any of the thunder from our interview, but something that Sungu and I shared. So we kind of came up through the doctoral ranks together. He did his PhD at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I did mine at Emory University, and so we would see each other at the Academy of Homiletics, which is our like preaching nerd conference that we have every year. And we just became good friends. And, over the years, I've read his work and he's read my work, and we've engaged one another in many ways. And so part of what it meant when we were coming through our PhD program, nobody was hiring anybody in the academy because schools were still recovering from the huge economic downturn. So
Yeah.
faculty were retiring, but they weren't filling those spots. And so I think in the 3 years between when I finished my PhD and when I got hired at Columbia, there were like 5 or 6 positions open. Like that's it. And so what that meant is that a lot of us were teaching online, teaching adjunctively,
Hmm.
and so I did some really bad teaching and preaching when I was figuring out how to do this stuff. But I realized that I was being actually prepared for the ministry that I'm in now at Columbia,
Mm.
because when I came to Columbia, we were like 90% white, 90% Presbyterian students. And it was very residential, like very, very
Yeah.
residential. But as since I've been here, the demographics have shifted substantially, and a lot more of our students are second career students. A lot more of them are commuters, and so we've begun to offer more online courses. And because I'd spent a few years, making all those mistakes that we all make when we start trying to teach or preach online,
Yes.
I was able to bring some of that to bear at Columbia, and I know that Sungu has done the same through his many ministry roles. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Wake Forest Divinity School,
Hmm.
and so he had some opportunities there. And then now he's at George Fox Seminary in Portland, Oregon, and I know he teaches some online there. So it's kind of like, he's the perfect person really to write this book. And he
Yeah.
just convened a special edition of the journal Religions on digital preaching.
Mm.
So I'll put a link to that in the description to the video below. So if you want to check those essays out, there's some really great essays in that collection.
Yeah. Perfect. So I was gonna give our listeners a little teaser, something that we mentioned, but really blew my mind about digital preaching, which the book, digital homiletics, which is virtual reality or integrated reality
Yeah.
preaching. And Ryan and I, my husband, when I was telling him about this book, we were sort of joking. We made a joke, just like, what about that one day? Like, what if preaching goes into the virtual reality space? And then I flipped to that chapter in the book, and there it was already there. So the way
Yeah.
that he's really up on the things that are happening and anticipating what might come next, and he even says he gives us 10 styles of online preaching that we can all explore. And there's a great encouragement to take advantage of different kinds of artistic representation and creative style, and to just really experiment in different ways. And that he acknowledges that there's room beyond these 10 styles. Like, there are
That's right.
probably ways we will encounter digital homiletics that we haven't even expected yet. So it's a book that really gets us thinking, and challenges us to not stick with just the preaching styles that we know, even
Right.
even the ones that we've gotten comfortable with for the last few years. There's room to explore more, for sure.
I am so excited that we're joined by my good friend, the Reverend Dr. Sunggu Yang. And this is going to be an amazing conversation because he's written an amazing book, Digital Homiletics, the Theology and Practice of Online Preaching. Sunggu, I'd love to start off just by hearing a little bit about why you wrote this book and what you hope that it will accomplish in the hearts and minds of your readers.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you so much. By the way, thanks so much for having me for this podcast. I truly appreciate it. So I believe we theologians, we generally write theological books when we have a question, problem, or an issue we want to address or even resolve. So the same applied to me. I wanted to address was even resolve a key question of mine, and that was twofold. First, what theology of digital online preaching is possible, or what can I propose? Second, what effective practices of online preaching uh, can be developed based on somehow informed theological and theoretic understanding of online preaching. The thing is that when the global pandemic hit between, it's been a history already, but between
Yeah.
2020 and 2022, preachers, they had these two fundamental questions in their mind, but they couldn't really find right resources to address these issues.
Right.
The same applied to me as well.
Mm-hmm.
So they were simply in the practical mode of just do it. Something good may happen or may not, but we have no time to wander around, so just do it.
Right.
That was the urgency, right? We were experiencing back then. I believe since then the situation has become much better as our online preaching habits and practices became much mature. But still, no doubt, we needed and need a fine resource for digital online preaching. So that's why I basically started writing this book based on the historical context, but still I believe there is a need for this kind of resource in today's world.
Yeah, there absolutely is. I was teaching a class on this last year and was looking for resources, and there's just a couple of journal articles,
Mhm.
but this book is going to really be a game changer. So thank you for writing it.
All right, good to
One
know.
of the fundamental differences that you name between a viewer's experience in a congregational setting and an online setting is you define it as the online participant's experience as purposeful
Yeah.
viewing. And that's really helpful to think about purposeful viewing as more intense and intentional
Mhm.
in that well, we have to be looking at the screen, into the screen to be a part of worship.
Yeah.
So, can you say more about this difference and how the online modality impacts the listener's experience?
Mhm.
And maybe even how did you come to realize this difference and name it in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
book?
That's a very important question, I believe. So, as part of my response, let me begin with this fun question, which is, have you ever done sermon shopping? I call it sermon shopping, by the way, on
Okay.
YouTube on Sunday mornings. To be very honest, I have done it several times, especially during the pandemic time, of course.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes these days as well, I'm very guilty about it. So, for instance, I watch right only the first 30 seconds of a sermon,
Mm,
and don't like it, and moved to a different channel or sermon.
yes.
Then again, I watch the first 20 seconds of a different sermon or second sermon, and don't like it again, and so move to the third one. At times, I moved, to being very honest, to the fourth and fifth one as well.
Mhm.
Why did I tell you this? When it comes to online preaching, just for your uh, having your question in my mind, when it comes to online preaching, it is not that you really have to listen to a sermon you may not appreciate. I know I sound really consumeristic at this point, but
Mm,
bear with me, please stay with me.
yeah.
So when it comes to online preaching, it is not that you really have to listen to a sermon you may not really appreciate, and it's not that you have no choice because you are now you are not in the four world physical sanctuary. You are not there at this point, right? In a typical sanctuary, you are simply stuck somehow, right? Whether you like to preach the sermon or not.
Hmm.
In a sense, in the sanctuary, right? That's a very passive listening behavior, right? Very passive listening behavior happens. You are just stuck there and you have to listen, even though
Right.
sometimes you don't want to be just like there, but
Hmm.
you have to be there. But again, when it comes to online preaching, the situation is quite different, as you just mentioned. You will, well, I can choose a specific preacher and a specific sermon because somehow you really like them, and because
Yeah.
you have a specific intent to watch it. And when you happen to like it really, you will stay with the sermon to the end, I believe. In that sense, I believe sermon viewing, I call it sermon viewing at this point when it comes to online preaching, not sermon listening. Of course, sermon listening happens, but sermon viewing is a better terminology, I believe, when it comes to online preaching. So sermon viewers and not the sermon listeners. Anyhow, so
Hmm.
in that sense, sermon viewing is very intentional, I believe, and purposeful. Of course, once again, that behavior could be very much consumeristic, but reality is reality when it comes to sermon viewers, right? So now you have some authority, right, to choose or move on.
Yeah.
That's somehow what I mean by purposeful viewing. So you have some authority and agency now when it comes to what you can watch, even what you really like. Somehow now you can even recommend what you really like to other folks instantly. So some good authority and agency is now on the sermon viewers, and that's why I call it purposeful viewing when it comes to online preaching. I hope that somehow makes sense to you.
It does. Hmm.
Yeah, and another thing that I so appreciate about this book is you recognize that we don't just need to change our practices, but we need to rethink our entire theology of proclamation, given this digitalized world. And you brought in Karl Barth's threefold nature of the Word of God, which,
Yeah.
for those who aren't aware, if you think about it as a bullseye, so the dead center would be Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
The center, moving one ring out, would be Scripture that bears witness to Jesus Christ, and then on the very outer ring, you'd have the proclaimed Word is the Word of God to the degree that it's bearing witness through Scripture to Jesus Christ. And then you add this fourth dimension that I'd love to hear you unpack. But I wanted to read this one quote that you have. You have so many great ways of writing
Oh, yeah,
these
very
things,
big
Sunggu.
time. Very
But
kind.
let me read this. You write, the digitalized word is not simply proximal to the world in an abstract sense or in a
Hmm.
monocultural sense. For example, the predominant white Western image of Jesus,
Yeah.
but enables each different culture to see and adopt Jesus as its own in a very meaningful way. Thus,
Hmm.
it is now better to say that Jesus is in and of each wonderful culture, than the monocultural Jesus is present in different cultures.
Hmm.
Especially for those less steeped in matters of Christology and digital media studies, can you break down what you see Karl Barth's threefold Word of God offers to us when we preach in these digitalized spaces?
Thank you, Jake, for that very profound question. So, specifically, I want to deal with the Christological matters happening in this book. Of course, that stands to Karl Barth. By the way, so in my writing, as just mentioned, I utilize Christology, or I adopt Christological matters somehow as a key component when it comes to the word digitalized I propose. So I utilize Christology in this book in a metaphoric or somehow metonymic way to denote the larger context of colonial embodiment and
Hmm.
practice of Christian faith. Of course, I do not really specifically mention it, the colonial embodiment and practice of Christian faith, but that's somehow implied, just as you mentioned.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
thanks to revealed word or Jesus, the incarnate Christ, in a historical sense. So Christianity has been, we all know this, Christianity has always been a historical or material religion, right? Material religion. There are lots of positive dimensions in having a material religion. I mean, for instance, a very positive view of this material world, right? Because God or Jesus embraces this material world. So we can call
Hmm.
Christianity a material religion. So that's not really like Platonic religions, right? Somehow very much a positive view of a material world we have in Christianity. But at the same time, because of that, right, we have experienced somehow negative result like colonial embodiment and practice of Christian faith in world history here in the material world. Specifically,
Hmm.
as just you mentioned, Western colonial views and practice of Christianity. They have somehow become a norm, not only here in the Western world, but in other parts of the colonized world. For instance, just as you said, a colonial image of Jesus, right? A blonde haired, blue eyed Anglo Saxon Jesus
Yeah.
saving people of colors out in the world, especially underdeveloped countries. So, just getting back to the point, the word digitalized or the digitalized word can somehow help overturn that colonial manipulation of Christianity thanks to its cross cultural ubiquity. That's the
Mhm.
terminology I use in my book, the cross cultural ubiquity and connectivity. So as I write in the book, online digitality of the incarnate world opens up a huge possibility of experiencing non-colonial or even post-colonial images of Jesus, liberating hermeneutical approaches and cross-cultural practices of Christian faith, I
Yeah.
believe both in the West and in the East, thanks to, once again, the open access online communication tools that we heavily utilizes in online preaching. So I believe in that sense we are living a very exciting stage, exciting time of
Yeah.
Christian history. Well, this
Absolutely.
there's open-ended, unlimited possibility of intercultural or cross-cultural ubiquity and connectivity, and somehow the huge possibility of breaking down our own past colonial perspectives and hermeneutics that we have somehow still saturated in theological education in our preaching practice. So I'm very excited about this new possibility that online preaching has brought to us.
Yes, definitely. There's a sense in which the access of Jesus in the way that you describe
Mm,
the images of Jesus, the digital word,
yeah,
was working already. And then the pandemic preaching was really thrust into that same kind of
yeah,
accessibility.
mhm,
And so online preaching's opened up all of our eyes to these new levels of accessibility
yeah,
and new creative avenues that we
mhm,
can explore in our preaching. And I'm probably not the only one, though, who has
mhm,
wondered if the online worship space maybe deprives us of some
mhm,
sensory bodily engagement. It
yeah,
can feel like that sometimes, where if
yeah,
I am just staring at a screen, am I really connecting with other worshipers as fully as I would be if I were in
mhm,
the church worship space in the physical environment?
uh-huh,
And so I think we've all been asking ourselves these questions. And I love that you point to how, with these rich digital artistic options,
mhm,
we are actually engaging our senses more than we realize. Maybe what we need is the attention
yeah,
on
yes,
those senses being engaged. So you say like 3 of our 5 human senses
yeah,
are being utilized: seeing, hearing, and touching.
uh-huh,
And then when we move to communion, for example,
yeah,
our smell and taste brain centers are starting to get activated just by seeing those on the screen. And
yeah,
then I know in my context, sometimes it meant that I was consuming my own communion elements while
yeah,
others were doing that wherever they were.
mm,
So, how else can preachers bring to the forefront this
uh-huh,
full sensory participation to
uh-huh,
help viewers be aware of all of their senses during digital preaching?
mhm.
And then, what benefits do you think this level of participation has for proclamation?
Yeah, totally. Actually, thanks so much for the question. I believe you've read my book very carefully and very critically. Appreciate it. So now I want to be clear about one thing based on your question. That is online preaching or online worship experience. My view, this is my very biased personal view. Online worship or online preaching experience cannot, I want to be clear about it, cannot and will not replace in-person worship or
Thanks
preaching
for saying that.
experience. Yeah. The two experiences, in my opinion, that must be mutually and equally supplemental in the 21st century.
That's good.
That
That's
is
really
the
good.
point. Yeah,
Yeah.
either one we must not lose. So in that sense, I argue that Christian worship these days, we all know this at this point, must be 100% in person and 100% digital at the same time in order for the worship to be meaningfully effective for the heavily digitally oriented sermon viewers today, especially in terms of the artistic and multisensory experience of Christian worship and preaching. So once again, it is not that we have to choose either option or one option is better than the other. I want to be clear about that. And that said, I want to emphasize that online preaching, what we're especially we are talking online preaching, right? Online preaching offers its unique, That's my point as well. Unique artistic multisensory experience thanks to its innate nature of creative digitality, just as you already mentioned through that experience in your own preaching experience and what you experience. It is, in my opinion, it is quite clear that digital artistry is different from conventional material artistry that we experience in the physical sanctuary, right? And the old wisdom applies here, I believe, which is a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Mm.
In the practice of conventional preaching, this is typical, right? We recognize and we utilize the terminology, by the way. We say the congregation as sermon listeners, right? Sermon listeners. In that context, words prevail, right? There are words and they are listening. We don't necessarily say, even in the physical sanctuary, artistically, beautifully decorated space, we are like, oh, they're some listeners. They are not some viewers,
Right.
right? Words prevails, right? Even 1,000 words prevail, I believe, in that kind of context. But as I argue in my book, online preaching recognizes the sermon as sermon viewers. I want to be really clear about that. Now they are sermon viewers more than or sermon listeners, right? Once again, and in that in this context, right, the the sermon viewers, they are now being exposed somehow, I believe, well, we can try very hard, to the five multisensory experience of worship and preaching, even in the online space.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as to your question on how to help sermon viewers, you have now recognized I'm using the terminology a lot. Sermon viewers,
Yes.
be, how can you help them be more aware of all their bodily senses during digital online preaching? My quick response to the question is this: well, it's a little bit too quick or too brief. But first, preachers, preachers, they have their own homework, right? They should more adopt digital artistry that I outline as seven online digital traits, theological or artistic traits in my own book. So there is some work the preacher should do. But second, when it comes to sermon viewers, they should feel more freedom. I think the preachers have to encourage the sermon viewer to have more freedom in their own artistic and multisensory experience of online preaching. I can give you one quick example based on from my own experience. I'm a well-brewed Presbyterian child. I'm very proud of my identity. Fine. Anyhow, so as a well-brewed Presbyterian child, I do not really necessarily dance around or shout out loud during in-person worship
Mm-hmm.
preaching. But guess what? I feel more freedom to do so. I mean, shout out loud or dance around when I worship online at home.
Wow.
Yes.
I actually sometimes actually danced around and clapped and even I practice speaking in tongues. I don't tell that anybody to anybody.
Okay.
We
My
won't tell
Okay,
Christian,
great.
your presbytery.
but as a good Pentecostal Korean Presbyterian, I'm very
Mm.
proud of my faith background and identity. Pentecostal Presbyterian, or charismatic Presbyterian. Yeah, I feel so liberated or can relate to the sermon message when I really like it with my whole body during
Yeah.
online preaching because once again I can do it. So allowing some space and freedom for the listeners. How about just emphasizing it to the online viewers? So verbally or written notice, just be yourself and be more you when it comes to online preaching, so that when the preacher brings more artistic oriented message and images and sounds and clips, they do that right during the online preaching. I hope the listener, oh, not the listener, some viewers uh, do the same or similar, have similar multisensory experience in their own context and at their own space. So that's what I hope when it comes to online preaching's artistic experience on the sermon viewers side.
Yeah, it makes me think almost that then it can inform our physical in-person worship spaces in some ways that bring about more accessibility and
Yeah.
more space for people that process differently and that need different kinds of sensory involvement
That's
to
correct.
actually have that space in the sanctuaries
Yeah.
too.
Hmm.
So yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, Sunggu, you and I have been friends for many years now and
Mm-hmm.
collaborators and fellow instigators in the Academy of Homiletics. And so you know that I'm a Bardian, and I'm pretty happy to claim that title, particularly the early Bart. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm all for this fourth dimension that you name, and I think that I love the example you just gave because it really puts some kind of like flesh on the bones of this theological superstructure you've created. But I was also a little surprised that you went with Barth here. In your
Mm-hmm.
last book, Arts and Preaching, an Aesthetic Homiletic for the 21st Century, you
Mm-hmm.
challenged homiletics' preoccupation with the what and the how of preaching, and you pushed us, importantly and helpfully, I think, to focus more on the who and the why of preaching. And there, your primary theological conversation partner was not Karl Barth, but Rudolf Otto.
Mm-hmm.
And Bart, as we know, has tended to de-emphasize the proclaimer in light of the proclamation.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear you reflect a little bit about
Mm-hmm.
how this fourth techno dimension of the word
Yeah.
might move us to focus a little bit on the who and the why,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in light of Otto's concept of the mysterium tremendum, or
Yeah.
as you talk about it in the Arts and Preaching book, the holistic aesthetic ground of preaching. I'd love to hear
Oh,
you kind of connect these two for me.
all right. Thanks, Jake, for that dimension of this book and my previous book as well, pointing that out. Appreciate it. So my response to that question or inquiry could be twofold, I believe. First, I think Rudolf Otto, the Mysterium Tremendum guy, Rudolf Otto and Barth are on the same page in a sense, but in terms of their heavy emphasis on the holy mystery of the
Yeah.
divine experience, right? Barth, like the holy other being out there as our God, somehow intervening in human history. But still, God is out there as the holy other. For the Rudolf Otto, that's a holy mystery, a mysterium tremendum. In that sense, I believe they are somehow on the same page. Second, I believe well defined or well trained and well practiced what and how of preaching, right? Well defined, well trained, well practiced what and how of preaching inevitably, I believe, lead to fine experiences of the holy divine mystery. That in turn naturally constitutes who and what of Christian preaching. So in that sense, I believe what and how on the one hand, and who and why, on the other hand, of preaching do not necessarily contradict each other. Of course, in the my previous book, as just mentioned, I had more emphasis on who and why side of preaching because somehow that's we are lacking in our homiletic education in today's classroom. But I'm not necessarily saying, yeah, we are done with what and how.
Oh yeah, of
We don't
course.
need anything. Well, we teach it right in the classroom how to write and how to design and how to deliver. So somehow I had a heavy emphasis on who and why in the book, but still, I believe they are mutually equally complementary when it comes to actual education, homiletical education, and preaching. So here is one analogy I thought about, which is when I think of world-class musicians like Leonard Bernstein, right, or world-class figure skaters like Yuna Kim from South Korea,
Mm-hmm.
they have inspired the profound feelings of awe and divine mystery, right? Somehow, in a sense, in the minds of people cross culturally, not necessarily in the East alone or West alone, but cross culturally, even though one guy from the West, the other from the East. So it is no secret, and I believe so true that they are well trained musicians and dancers. They know what and how very much.
Sure.
Who perform right their best practice of their artistic discipline. In that sense, their what and how somehow transformed people's why, people's who and why when it comes to their own practice. I believe the same applies to the practice of preaching as well. Well
Mm.
delivered, well performed preaching that always involves somehow what and how, I believe, that transforms not only the preacher's spirituality or helps their spiritual formation, but also the spiritual formation of the sermon viewers or listeners.
Hmm.
And even when it comes to Karl Barth, he was a well-trained theologian, right? He knew Greek and Hebrew and Latin, every
Hmm.
knowledge possible he could get from theological institutions and education, and he used it somehow to write thousands of pages of church dogmatics in order to explain the unknowable holy mystery of God. What a paradox, right?
Yeah.
Right.
In his mind, God is up there. We don't really cannot know that white guy was. He was writing thousands of pages to explain that through his highly well trained theological discipline. So, what and how and who and why, I guess, I believe so. They could, but they must go hand in hand,
Yeah.
supplementing each other. So, my point is when it comes to online preaching, right, it has its own, as we have discussed, its own unique opportunities and advantages, or its unique what and how in promoting the holistic artistic ground of preaching and achieving the multidimensional spiritual formation of the preacher and the sermon viewers as we have experienced over the years. So I believe this is once again, this is a very exciting time. We have now the second primary tool to achieve holistic aesthetic experience of preaching and the spiritual formation of the preacher and the sermon viewers through online space or communication tool. Besides, once again, besides the in-person physical space we have still out there,
Yeah.
historically and culturally.
That's great.
Thank you.
There's so much possibility for the development of this, and in part thanks to your book and naming some of the things that we've been trying to sort out for the last few years, but
Mhm.
but not really having to do it, as you say, before, just do it before we had the chance to think it out. So
Mhm.
much of our conversation thus far has been about really coming from part one of your book, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
some of this theological work of what's happening when we are
Mhm.
preaching. And then part two of your book takes us through 10 styles of online preaching, and seeing these, reading what you have to say about them and the research you've done on these styles, it's so helpful. I was seeing myself in the ones that I've used and other preachers that I know, and then I was imagining others I haven't tried, like VR preaching, virtual reality, or
Oh yeah.
it's so fascinating to think where preaching could go.
Uh-huh.
Um, and even beyond the 10 styles that you named. So I'm curious, do you have a go-to style when you preach online? Or is there a style that you find the most effective for your experience? And then
Mhm.
what did you discover about the multitude of options available to preachers in and beyond these styles when you were writing this book?
Thank you actually for that question. I had my own fun experiences I can share, so I appreciate that question. So personally speaking, I do not really have a like a the go-to style among the 10 I discussed in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But at least, as you somehow guessed, I have utilized at least a couple of specific styles of those 10 styles I discussed in my own book. And I believe I mentioned those two experiences in the preface of the book as well. So let me just share what I experienced and how I felt it, and how they somehow impact as I envision the future of online preaching. So as I share in my book, I used two styles primarily: the podium style
Mm-hmm.
and the Zoom style for two different occasions. By the way, for two different church contexts.
Okay. Yeah.
One was for the Korean American church here in Oregon, and the other also on Oregon, but for a predominantly Caucasian Presbyterian church. I felt that when the sermon was done, the both styles worked very well. Even though I was really nervous doing it because that was the very beginning of the pandemic, by the way. So I was like, oh my goodness, I talked about all these, I thought about all these days, but now I'm invited to actually practice it. So I was really nervous, but at the end, I felt really good about those. Anyhow, so for any good Korean American churches, because I know the culture, the podium style is a go-to style when it comes
Mm.
to online preaching. that can work really best for their cultural context and for the preacher. And for the Presbyterian church for which I preached, the congregants seemed to be really enjoying, and they were doing it. They started doing it, of course, by the way, during the pandemic, the Zoom style, as they
Yeah.
allow them to respond simultaneously to the
Yeah.
preacher's sermon through the chat box. And
Yeah.
I found they were really enjoying it. Somehow, the church was uh, uh, has more elderly folks than the younger generation folks in the church. But even those elderly folks, they were really enjoying the Zoom style because once again, it allowed them to respond to the preacher's
Right.
message simultaneously and in the real time. So it was a very fun experience to have. I mean, once again, we just started, right? So 3 or 4 years ago, Zoom was, right?
Yeah.
Which was never imagined before the pandemic, right?
Exactly.
This is something really new, and I mean, there's something good can happen in this Zoom space, and I was really shocked when I got the invitation email, phone call. I thought it was email saying, "Oh, so Dr. Yang or Sunggu, this coming 2 weeks ago." 2 weeks later, I don't really know, but this coming Sunday, we want you to preach for these churches, Presbyterian churches of worship. But the thing is, you don't have to come to the church, right?
Right.
You just preach from your home office or wherever you can preach, and we will join Zoom you and everywhere else as well. So that was a very exciting time, and they were experiencing very innovative way of doing sermon or preaching or worship in general. But once again, uh, the point is they were really enjoying that innovation.
Yeah.
And the Zoom styles, the strongest advantage, which is simultaneous somehow conversation, right? Dialogue with the preacher when the preaching is still going on. So
Mm,
if the preacher can do it, right, they can get the simultaneous real-time responses and feedback questions, right, on the chat box. And
yeah.
they can just stop their own script or manuscript and start responding somehow taking their own manuscript or script, their plan beside away, they can now start responding to people's real questions, their own interpretation of the text, or somehow their own, let's just say, objection to
Mm,
what the preacher say. I
Yeah.
preach, I don't agree with that. Can you answer my question right now, right away? Of course, you
wow.
could chat like, "Oh, well, I can respond to you later." That's better response, by the way, which cannot happen during the brick and mortar church, right? Because you are the
Yeah.
one who's only speaking during the sermon
Mhm.
time. But anyhow, that experience really was exciting. I mean, I got really excited, and that somehow informed me that something good happened right on the online space, and that is really good for the sermon viewers these days,
Yeah.
besides the sermon experience happening in the main sanctuary. So my hope is this, just to summarize: preachers can adapt and enjoy different styles, tried on, let's just say, even when you cannot do like the artistic style or the metaverse VR style, but you can do it, I believe, for some special occasions or
Mhm.
for special topics,
Certainly.
so that the 7 traits of online preaching I deal with in the book can be utilized widely and wisely in different for different occasions and for special topics. So as I'm really familiar with those two, the podium style and Zoom style, I believe other preachers they may find their own, I believe, very much a familiar style they want to go with or stick to. Then once again, my recommendation is just try others for
Mhm.
special occasion. Let's say when it comes to Easter or Christmas or the Lent, right? Season or
Yeah.
Ash Wednesday, some other different styles could be really helpful, expanding people's interpretive or their hermeneutic horizons, or interculturally, or the digitally as well, or multisensorily, I believe. So that's my
Yes.
recommendation and my own hope for the future of online preaching at this point.
Mm.
Yeah, you'll have to let us know if you decide to offer a metaverse sermon. I'd love to jump in. In fact, when I was reading your book, I have
Mhm.
an Oculus and I like to play games on it sometimes
Ah,
to kind of
I see.
when I'm not reading or writing. And so I thought, oh, I'll show up for the church. So I looked online and it was like, okay, it's at this time. And I wandered around and I'm not sure if I went to the wrong
Wow.
place or what was going on, but nobody, it's the equivalent
Nobody's
of like that I've only ever had on like, you know, when we turn back the clocks in the spring
there.
and you show up and you're like, where's everybody? Or
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
so it
somewhere
was
else.
weird.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, so probably I can try it one time, I guess. Then I can invite you all to the space. By the way, I was watching one CNN article and CNN interview one day. It happened even before the pandemic, by the way. A teenager back then, now he will be probably in his 20s, I believe. He started a worship service. You will get really, you may already know about it, but you will be still surprised. He created worship space and he does actual worship in the gaming space. So,
Wow.
so you know all the gaming platforms are available
Yeah.
out there, right? So he was a teenager. He's like, oh my goodness! On Sunday morning when I do my game, all the teenagers are here, not in the church.
Wow. Right.
So let me start a church where games happen. I can send you the link about. I believe still the link is available out there somewhere. And he studied the church. The problem, what for the Presbyterians, I believe, or some other the mainline church folks, he was not ordained. He had no theological education,
Mm,
but his credential was, yeah, my grandpa was a missionary.
wow.
And I still go to church Sunday in the morning, but in the afternoon, I do the online worship service with all the teenagers coming from all over the world. And he's like,
Yeah.
guess what? They don't go to physical church anymore, but they come over here and share the good
Right.
news of Christ. So this
Yeah.
is a missional church in a true sense.
Hmm.
I was like, you boy, you're doing a great job.
Yeah, and we've already been challenged so much by
Yeah,
what church is and how it can be,
yeah,
especially since the pandemic. And so
mhm,
these insights and examples really give us a lot of thinking to
yeah,
do
that's true.
about
Yeah,
what church can look like. I think
yeah,
your book has opened up, if preachers are already a few years in starting to feel a bit stuck
yeah.
in their podium or Zoom style preaching, then
Mhm,
you've given us all these other examples to try out, as you say. So, and then there's a world beyond that with
yeah,
technology we haven't even anticipated yet. So it really models for us, I think, too, how
yeah.
we can practice that same kind of openness and excitement about new technology, and then just think critically about what benefits it brings and
Mhm.
what challenges does it present, and how can we engage it in the most faithful way that we know how without the fear of just because it's different we shouldn't try.
That's
So
that's
yeah,
right.
I'm grateful for your work for that
Mhm,
reason, really what it models
mhm.
for us.
Thank you, Ashley, for that. I'm just
Yeah.
going off with it as my final word. I truly appreciate the pastors, local pastors, who pioneered on all these different styles of preaching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, I have practiced some of it, but my book is truly based on what they have struggled with, what they
Right.
invented, and what they were doing out there. So I truly appreciate what the local preachers struggled with and developed, they invented, and make available to us scholars and to other preachers as well. So I truly appreciate
Absolutely.
what people are
Thanks
doing
for
out
naming
there.
that.
Sunggu, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And preacher creatures, please go out, get digital homiletics. It will offer you so many rich opportunities for proclaiming God's word in digitalized spaces. And we always like to ask our guests if there's a project that you have in the works that you want to share with us. We'd love to hear about it and maybe have you on again to talk about it in the future.
Not much, but as here, Jake, my good colleague and friend
This is
for
a setup
many
question for
years.
him.
Our co-authored book is coming out called Preaching Philosophy. I believe this at the end of this year or next year. I believe that will be a great resources for the preachers and the seminarians. And uh, there is potential that a book on digital, not this book, but a similar book. But I compiled some essays from different authors, and that book on digital pulpit That's the main title. Could come up by the end of this year or next year, but that will be somehow supplemental resource to this book I'm publishing this month.
Oh, that's
So
great.
that's something, yeah, that will come out.
Yeah. Yeah. For those of you who don't know, in addition to writing this book and then writing a book with me, Sunggu has also edited a special edition of the journal Religions focused on this, and has amassed a really interesting group of scholars to weigh in on this in different ways. So thank you for all your hard work. The church and the academy are benefiting from all your labors. So we appreciate you.
All right. Thanks for having me today. I truly appreciate this. Enjoy conversation today.
Bye, everyone.